Have you ever thought to yourself, how do people end up on the ATF's radar?
Yeah. You have them with you by any chance?
Well, that's what I'm going to talk about today as I give you the 7 most common ways that you can have unwanted dealings with the ATF. Now, the first thing I want to say right off the rip is I am no defender of the ATF and their actions. They have done some really heinous things to regular gun owners for basically nothing in some circumstances, and I think they're a terrible organization. I think they are a part of the 3-letter agencies right now that are seriously actually on the chopping block. Working on a video on that too, so if you don't believe that statement, make sure you stay tuned for an upcoming video where I'm talking about that. Regardless, they're still there though. So there's going to be things here in this list where you're like, man, that's really stupid. Who would do that? Well, I have some examples. But then there's other things that are on this list that you, just regular law-abiding gun owners, may have actually already done yourself. And so you may say, wow, that's really stupid, or holy crap, I've done that. So these are some really common and some really dumb ways to actually end up on ATF's radar here. And of course, my biggest thing is I don't want anybody from my communities, Headshot Nation, Patreon, here, subscribers, nobody to have unwanted interactions with the ATF. So hopefully this can help you out. Of course, I want to hear from y'all. Have you ever had an unwanted interaction with the ATF? Leave your stories down below. Let's go ahead and jump right in. Now let's talk about the first one. And this one's pretty self-explanatory, and I think a lot of you guys are going to be like, dude, that's so stupid. Why would anybody do that? And you're right. That is posting illegal things online, especially if you already are on the radar for separate crimes that you committed. This was the story of a guy up in Michigan. He was wanted for burglary and some other things in a neighboring county, and here he is posting on his Instagram, guns, that little green plant they don't like you to have with guns, no matter what state you're in. And ATF, local police, they're like, oh, well, this guy's making this really easy for us. Remember that no matter if you have 1 million followers or 10 followers, if the ATF is already watching you, if local police are already watching you, that can be reason enough for them to straight up bust you or come to your home. All they're looking for is a little bit of evidence to support their claims. And in this case, they already wanted this guy. Everything you post on the internet, no matter if you delete it, can be brought back up and used against you. You're just telling on yourself to the entire world, and you think, oh, I don't have a big following, nobody's ever going to see this. That's not always the case. Whatever you do inside of your home is your business, and keep it that way by keeping a camera off of things that you do. Unless you want people to see those things, keep a camera off of it. And if you're going to have a camera on, as much as we all hate the rules and regulations, you gotta stay inside of those whenever you're creating a video or you're doing anything when it comes to firearms, unless you just want one of these dealings with the ATF. Here's one that I found so disturbing that I actually plan on making an entire video dedicated to just this. And that is where you shop with your credit card or even your debit card online. Banks will actually report information to places like the ATF in order to kind of build a case against you, or at the very least bring attention to some of the things that you are purchasing. Now, there's been kind of a big stink about the fact that banks are now using codes to designate gun stores and gun purchases. And of course, gun control advocates have been like, oh my God, this is such a great thing. You're going to be able to stop violent crime all over the United States, which we know is a joke, but let's just be honest, banks don't need to have codes in order to tell where you're making purchases from. Now, I know this sounds very sketchy, but it is unfortunate that banks, in order to kind of absolve themselves from any kind of liability, will report to local law enforcement and even the ATF if they suspect that you are doing something illegal. Try to see if there's any patterns that have been established. So, okay, you're always buying ammo, whatever, once a month, and then all of a sudden you start buying cases and cases and cases of ammo along with guns, right? You went from 1 box of ammo, maybe a gun a month, to now 15 guns and 15 pallets of ammo, let's just say 15 cases, you know what I mean? This could be a red flag to the banks, and they could turn your information in. Your information is already out there, right? You know, you see these ads for things that you've recently looked up, right? And that cache data and all of that and all those cookies are basically tracking, oh, this guy loves, you know, Smith & Wesson or whatever the case is. And then you start seeing ads for that thing across every single site you are on. I think this is a good reminder too, even to myself, because I never carry cash, that sometimes just get cash. So that way they have no idea what you're doing with your own money. This is very disturbing. Even if you're a super pro gun control type of person, which there's not a lot of people here in my channel that are watching this video, maybe that are super pro gun control, but still this kind of shows you that your privacy is always being impeded and infringed upon, and in order to keep that privacy private, sometimes there are some ways around it. But if you don't know, the banks can absolutely hand your information off to the ATF, and you could have some interactions with them that you never even saw coming, and that is one way to do it. And if you didn't know about this, well, now you do. And yes, banks can absolutely talk to the ATF and hand over your profile if they think something suspicious is going on. Well, here's another one that unfortunately can happen to quite a few people. If you buy multiple guns at one time, there's nothing wrong with that. But FFLs have to report those sales to the ATF. So at a minimum, they're going to get your name and your address, and they're going to keep these files indefinitely. And there's a variety of different ways they do this. Since the Gun Control Act of 1968, FFLs are required to turn in this information when 2 or more guns are bought within a certain amount of time. Let's say you live on a border state, California, New Mexico, Texas, Arizona. If you buy a semi-automatic gun of any type, basically, rifle especially, that accepts a detachable mag, guess what? They're going to turn your information in to the ATF. If you buy 2 pistols at the same time or within 5 days of each other, again, your information is submitted to the ATF. And what they're looking for is a short, I think it's crime to sale or sale to crime ratio. So essentially, if one of your firearms, and they're able to trace it back to you, shows up within a certain amount of time of a sale to a crime, then they suspect that you could be doing things you shouldn't be doing with those firearms. Another way to get yourself in a bad situation is if you don't go through an FFL. Now look, private transfers and sales are totally legal in a lot of states, okay? And they should be, because it's none of the government's business what guns you have, okay? That is just my position, and I hold that to be one of the foundational principles of the Second Amendment, right? It is not their business to know every gun you have. But be careful. When you're selling a gun to an individual, you cannot knowingly sell to somebody that's already a felon. And if you take possession of a firearm and that gun has been traced back to a crime, you end up with it. You get pulled over. You're like, oh yeah, I'm good. Everything, you know. Let's say you're in a state where you have to declare that you are a concealed weapons permit holder. You're like, yeah, okay, here's my permit and whatever. They end up seeing your gun for whatever reason. Some cops want to disarm you, and I'm not defending this, but some cops want to disarm you when you come in contact with them, and they'll give you your gun back after the interaction. They run the serial number on that firearm. Well, guess what? If it comes back to a traced firearm, you could be held liable for that, no matter where you got it from. That's why it's always a good idea to get a little bit of information. I know this is kind of one of those things some people like, some people don't like, and I totally understand that. But in order to clear your name, sometimes just as good as saying, hey, you know, only if you have a CWP will I engage in that with you. Because at the end of the day, that person isn't going to care if you get jammed up because they got their money and they're scot-free. And if you don't have any kind of information to go back on and just say, hey, this is the person I bought from, then you could be in hot water for something you didn't even know you were getting in the middle of. So any kind of sketchy sales, any kind of sketchy people that you come across, make sure that when you're doing anything like this, It's in an open area where there's a lot of people. Not a lot of, you don't want a lot of people seeing what you're doing, but, where there are people, it's never in the middle of the night out in somewhere where there's nobody around. And make sure that you're caring. You want to be able to protect yourself in these situations. I've come across some really great people in the past. I don't really do this anymore, but back when I first started the channel, that's kind of how I kept things going, right? And so I had some great dealings with some awesome people. There were some sketchy ones though too, where I just didn't feel comfortable with the whole situation. Sometimes it's okay to walk away too. Just say, I don't feel great with this. Whatever excuse you need. Just make sure that you're on the up and up when it comes to stuff like that. And sometimes it's not even something that you're doing, right? This could be one that you're like, dang, dude, I didn't even know I could be involved in stuff like that. And this is simply being friends with somebody that's under investigation from the ATF. Remember, these investigations are far-reaching, and they will gain any knowledge they possibly can on the person they're investigating and the contacts that they have frequently, and the people they're connected with as well. Now look, at some point in our lives, you've probably come across somebody that you might have been friends with, maybe good friends, maybe just acquaintances or whatever, but you kind of knew that they weren't always on the up and up. You kind of knew that they liked to bend rules and break laws. And while that may not have kept you from being friends with them, when you yourself are a gun owner, right? There are ways that you can actually become a quick ex-gun owner and a prohibited person by being in contact with some of these people. Because if the ATF's investigation finds that you're constantly talking back and forth with this person, well, you could expect to get a knock at your door saying, hey, we want to know about your connections with John Doe. There's been a couple of times that I can think of right now where I have cut people out because I just knew they were kind of bad news. And when you get older, you start to realize, man, some people just do not change. When you're in high school, some of us do some really stupid things. But then you'll start to realize, okay, 25, 30 years old, Jesus, these people are still doing stuff like this. Sometimes it is just a good idea to cut some people out of your life because they can create a headache for you. And when it comes to these ATF interactions, it's not always just as simple as, hey, we're just knocking on your door to find out what's going on. And if the ATF does come to your door, by the way, make sure that you have somebody to call. I know that a lot of concealed carry insurance policies and stuff will have somebody, right? You don't ever want to be answering questions and potentially incriminate yourself without legal counsel. And remember, this video isn't legal advice. I'm just a guy on the internet giving you my opinion. But I think one of the best pieces of advice that I probably could have gotten when I was younger is that not everybody is worth the mess that can actually be stirred up in your own life just by being associated with them. Now, this one applies to FFLs and could really seriously have your entire life upended because of very simple mistakes here. But let's say an FFL there was one story I read on NSSF where the guy liked to keep all of his paperwork neat. He was very particular about the way the paperwork was conducted. So he would call customers in advance of them picking up a gun, and he would fill out the information for them. He would also check off the boxes, the yeses and nos, on the 4473. Well, the problem is when you certify and submit those 4473s, you're saying that all of the information is true on that form, but if somebody else does it for you, well, this obviously can't be true. Now, even if they fill it out correctly, it doesn't matter. You yourself, the person that's filling out the 4473, has to do everything. And if mistakes need to be corrected, then you're the one that has to go through and actually fix those mistakes. What if an FFL actually transfers a firearm to somebody after a 3-day waiting period for whatever reason, and they count holidays and weekends, which are not supposed to be counted? And then the FBI calls back and says, hey, nope, you cannot transfer that firearm. If they've already done that, then the ATF will pick up the gun and then revoke your license. It's an unfortunate fact, too, that you can get a visit from an ATF because of an ex-spouse, maybe a neighbor that knows you're a gun owner and they don't like guns, somebody in your personal life that knows you're a gun owner, and they don't like guns. Now you may say this is ridiculous. Why would family members do this to each other even if they just disagreed? Well, anybody with a family knows that certain family members take this stuff to the extreme. I know this all too well because of this past election. I've had people very close to me that have actually cut me out of their lives entirely. So there, unfortunately, are a lot of people that could be in your family that could cause really serious issues for you. And while it's really cool and firearms are awesome, right? I mean, they're just awesome, right? I mean, not only is it a fundamental right, not only is it something that you can enjoy and have multiple uses for, but guns are just cool and they're cool to show off. Sometimes you may want to hold off on the next family get together if you have somebody that is there that you know is totally anti-gun, because again, they could cause a serious headache for you, especially in states that have adopted some of these red flag laws. Just be really careful with that. And the last one I want to talk about is FFLs that either refuse to give data on a trace gun within 24 hours or even refuse ATF entrance into their place of business. This is another one, and according to one of my friends that works at a gun shop, they don't really get a lot of visits. But when ATF comes a knocking, you got to open that door for them when you're an FFL. And I think this keeps a lot of people from becoming their own FFL because they don't want to deal with this. And that is a part of it. If the ATF says, hey, we're coming to do an inspection, they may give you a date, they may give you a time range, but you have to let them in. No questions asked. They need a trace on a firearm. I've heard in the same article, actually, NSSF, they said that, some dealers will get calls at 3 o'clock in the morning saying, hey, we need trace data on this. Can you meet us at your place of business? It's discretionary, I suppose, because legally you have 24 hours, but those are situations that could arise. And then, of course, barring entry to any ATF agent, well, that's going to get you in a lot of trouble, and you're probably going to lose your license. According to this article from the NSSF, it's like 100% of the time, basically, you are going to lose your license if you deny them entry. These are some kind of unexpected, but very common ways that people actually get visits, unwanted visits from the ATF. And again, if you've ever had an unwanted dealing with anybody from the ATF, leave your stories down below. We'd actually love to kind of hear those and just see what your experience was actually like. And again, this is not condoning anything that the ATF does, but more so as a way for you to know how many different ways there are for you to come up on ATF's radar. If you like what I do, consider subscribing. See you in the next one. And as always, hold it down.